Welcome to the castle, everybody. This is Nightsaber Z42, and today I'll be reviewing Spectacular Settlements. Let's get right to it. So here we have the book for Spectacular Settlements, and the author is Andrew Geertsen, published by Nord Games. Very awesome publishing company, by the way. And the hard copy is actually stitch bound, so it does a pretty good job at staying open. And this beast is like 457 pages, not including the different settlement character sheets, I guess you could call them, and the actual grid in the back of the book for creating your fortress. So I didn't actually calculate those pages included. So this book is actually separated into 8 different chapters. So we get started with an introduction, and then each of the chapters following the introduction actually goes into a different settlement. And if you've seen my videos on those tutorials, then you'll pretty much get a good idea about how those are set up and run. So the first chapter is actually the introduction, which is a very useful chapter compared to most other introduction chapters that I've seen in other supplements or even like D&D products, because it actually tells you pertinent information like what to expect in each settlement, what the actual settlements are, and how they differentiate from each other, and some of the types of roles that you can expect to actually make with those settlements. And so it's a very handy chapter. If you actually are going through the process for the first time, it's definitely worth a read through. But the first real chapter that we're going to take a look at is the trading post. And from this point on, we actually start small in scope. And then as we progress through each chapter, our scope is getting bigger and bigger. We're adding more things and more features and more options. So for trading post, we get started with a nice little illustration that depicts that settlement, as well as some fluff text. And I actually really enjoyed reading through the fluff text. It just sets the mood. And then on the opposite page, we get an overview, what to expect, and then we actually get started with the first step, which is always going to be the basic information. And so every so often, we'll actually get one of these little text boxes that's got very important information. If you see it, read it. This is the type of book where you're going to want to read everything, because there's some very pertinent information that you might miss out on, like I did when I was rolling my first couple settlements. And so you don't want that to happen. Definitely read everything. And this book does a very good job at keeping up with its verbiage. So like if it's in the character sheet, it's going to be bolded, and that's going to be your important information. So let's go and do a very quick tutorial about what to expect. So you are going to have these tables. You're going to see what the information is on that table, and you're just basically going to roll that die. So for example, our origin is a D8 table, and so we would just roll a D8, and then whatever we get, we can write it down on our character sheet. Now, what you can do, like I've done in some of my videos, is just pick and choose what you want if you have an idea in mind. If you don't have an idea in mind, then definitely go with the randomness and see what really cool things you could come up with. But there are different categories. So like we had origins in the first page, then we get into specialty, the age of the settlement, what condition it's in, and how many visitors actually travel through that specific settlement. We get a size and the environment that it's in, and then we get to step 2, which is community. So the community is all about the demographics of that settlement. So we get like the resident population, the actual demographics, how many races actually live in that settlement, as well as their disposition towards other people outside of that settlement, whether they're hostile or openly friendly. And we get law enforcement, which is very useful for a settlement that's probably on the outskirts of civilization. You get leadership, population, wealth, as well as their crime rate, which is always very interesting. This actually determines your urban encounters that your players can actually go through. And so you're just rolling dice and getting all of these random results and figuring out little ways to kind of connect them. And it's a very interesting like puzzle game sort of deal. I really enjoyed the randomness. And so the last section of each of these chapters is going to be your points of interest. So this is what makes your settlement kind of stand out. So usually we get a number of shops as well as the specific shops that are in that settlement. So you're going to have your mundane shops like your bakers and butchers and coppers, things that actual people need within these settlements to actually, make a living or live in luxury. So it's really interesting that they included that, and I'm really thankful that they did, because it's not something that usually comes up in a game. And then we also have services. So like if you're trying to hire a hireling or a retainer or something like that, then that's where you would find that sort of information here. I also want to point out that the artwork in this book is actually really outstanding. It's got like this, I don't know, like an architect pencil type artwork. And you do get some really weird artwork, like doorways, like pictures of doorways or like a shrine. And it's just really random, but it really does fit the theme of the book. So I can't really fault them for that. And then as we go along in the chapters, you're going to have to start thinking about like your places of worship. What kind of a deity do those specific people worship? How frequently do they go to church and stuff like that? And then you get like some extra intrigue. These are just things that can kind of like serve as hooks, sort of, for your players if they should go to this location. They're really interesting. When I was going through my actual tutorials, I never really went through the extra intrigue because these are things that I want my players to kind of discover on their own. I don't want it written down because it could change on the spur of the moment depending on the needs of what my players are doing. So I never really did roll on the extra intrigue tables. Each chapter does end with quite a handful of samples of that specific settlement. When I mean handful, I actually mean like there's a ton of them. So, and that's really cool because if you need something to plug and play, then you would just take one of these and just put it in whichever world that you happen to be developing. Or you could actually get some ideas. And I really do like that they include like a picture for it, what it possibly looks like. And they also include a map. Now, the maps here are kind of hit and miss. Some of them are really like generic. And then there are some that really kind of shine out. So you can see here that each of these sample settlements for the trading posts, they're 2 pages. And as we go on, they're going to get progressively bigger, obviously, because when we get to capitals, that's a major development. And so I really do also like that some of these settlements kind of stand out. Like, for example, take Vilitharnia right here. It's like a little trading post that's in the trees. You could probably use that for like some sort of an elfin land type, or just make it stand out. It's really interesting. Okay, there's one that's like carved out for the cliffs there. It's pretty cool. And so the next chapter is going to be about villages. So much of the information found here is also going to pertain from the previous chapter. So we're adding things between each chapter. And so when we actually talk about villages, this is actually, to me, the black sheep of the entire book. And I'll explain why at the end. But we're actually taking some things away from this specific settlement. And if I had to be nitpicky for a minute, I would actually put villages as the first settlement that your players could come across, because there's actually less here than there is in the trading post. So we do get the same basic information. We are actually adding hardships this time around. These are things that really kind of make your village stand out, like in terms of history. So when your players go there, they could be facing some sort of a hardship, or 2 or 3 or 4. And so those are really interesting if your players plan on staying in a village for long term. So the information here, though, is quite similar than what you would find in trading posts, although now you're getting into things like, what are they providing for the area? Like, what are the resources? So these are really good things to think about when you're creating a village. You get demographics, as well. Crime, everything that was in the trading post is also here, as well as your place of gathering. You do get some shops, although they kind of really say probably not as a whole, not very many shops in a village, because villages are supposed to be very remote. Whereas trading posts, from my understanding, is supposed to be actually on the road, between actual maybe major intersections and stuff like that. You do get your extra intrigue, your political rumors, any superstitions that happen to be surrounding that village. And there's also a section for like what the weather is like in that specific region, which I think was actually pretty cool. I actually really do like some of the villages here, especially Ursatz's Canopy, because it's another very unique concept. It's a village in the trees. And I really like things that stand out like that. I mean, just look at this map here. It's really beautiful. And if I remember correctly, this is the village where it's like you have one people on one side of the river and there's like another people on the other side of the river and they're like at odds with each other. Or maybe that's something I came up with, but I don't know. I do like some of these samples, but again, some of them just seem kind of pretty generic. And that's okay. I mean, they all can't be spectacular, There has to be some mundanity to it all. Look at that North Comp. Another one that's off in the cliffs there, Stone's Throw. Very interesting name. And then we get to towns. So our scope is getting bigger. The addition that we get into towns from villages is the inclusion of a market square. So now our players can actually go to a market square, and this is where basically the other villages in the area will actually congregate to sell their wares or whatever resources that they're gaining. We get the same basic information that fleshes everything out, although this time we're adding priorities. So like, what does this town actually focus on? Is it military, government, production, economic, religious, or magic? So we're specializing things, we're making things a little bit more deeper, things are getting very detailed. And so we get to determine the condition, what kind of environment it's in. And since we're adding a market square, we actually have to start thinking about the vendor stall acquisition. Like, how easy is it for a vendor to actually set up shop here? And what the merchant overflow is like. Is there a merchant overflow, or is the city guard against that sort of thing? So these are really interesting ideas that they're putting in this supplement, and I really dig that. But one of the things that we're going to start seeing here very shortly is how much detail is too much detail. Like, am I actually really going to use all this information here? That's a question that you as a GM are going to actually have to answer for yourself. I actually have an answer for me, which might not apply to you. So after, of course, this entire chapter, we get some sample towns. And so the scope is still getting bigger. The towns are getting a little bit more flavorful in a way, which is really cool. This is an example of one of those maps that I just didn't really care for because it just looks a little plain. And that's okay. Sometimes you need a plain map. But this is more of my jam, this type of artwork. Something that could actually be in a Dungeons & Dragons book. So, really cool. And I really do like that some people, because these, if I remember correctly, these are from Kickstarter. If you actually got to that tier, you got to create a specific settlement for this book, I think. Don't quote me on that. But I really do like how some people kind of try to, make it culturally appropriate, differentiate it in a little bit. So that's also really cool. So in case you're running one of those Eastern type games, or maybe even something like an African type theme, there's actually some sample settlements that'll help you out there too. So then we get to cities, so we're getting much bigger and bigger. The information from the previous chapter still applies, we're just getting more detailed. This time, we're adding districts. And districts are actually really cool. Like, That's one of my favorite mechanics in this game. But it's also at this point where the time it actually takes to roll everything out increases exponentially. Don't think that this is a fairly quick roll. These are not. As you add more details, you're going to be spending a lot more time going through this. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and skip to some of the new stuff. So now that we have cities, we get to think about what's outside the city and also who is running the city, the stewardship. We also have, like I said, we have our districts instead of community. And so we can have up to 6 districts, although it's your city. You can add more districts if you want, although on the character sheet there's only room for 6. And the districts are actually the types of districts that you have available are things like administration districts, the arcane district, botanical district, a craft district, docks district, industrial district, market district. So things that you would expect to see in a fantasy setting. And when you actually choose a district, you get some things that are for free, but then you also roll for the extra stuff. And some of the extra stuff does repeat, which that's fine. But as a house rule for me, if I have something that's in a district already and I roll for that and I get that same thing, I will actually just go ahead and re-roll because I want my cities to actually be varied. I don't want, like 2 bakers that are really outstanding. I mean, that could be really fine. You could do stuff with that. But again, is that really going to be something that my players are going to take notice of? Maybe not. Something that I really did enjoy from the city section is what's underneath the city. So you could have like a sewer system, or you could even have like crypts down there. And that's where I think my players would be very interested in. Like those sorts of hooks, those are things I really like. And then of course we get our sample cities as well as the artwork. And you can see that our first one, Barflat, here is 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, including the map. So it's not going to take any small amount of time to actually go through this. I do like this amount of detail on these maps. That's what I really like. Retiverse. Scald. And I do like that there's also a variety of the different environments that some of these cities represent too. And then we get the capitals, the biggest section of the entire book. So capitals are much like cities. You're going to have your districts. You're going to have to think about who's running everything in the capital. But we're actually going to start including things like espionage and spies and the relationships between this capital and the other areas of your world. So if you have a fully fleshed out world, that's really cool. If not, then those will probably be things that you'll be skipping, at least for now. So we do get to think about stuff that's outside the capital, the fortifications, who's running. We also talk about government. How is this capital run? And how do the people view that ruler? How do the nobles view that ruler? How do the normal peasants view the nobility and stuff like that? So those things that can really create interesting dynamics for your players, those are included here. And that's fine. I really do dig that. So just like in every other chapter, we do get one for community and the demographics, although the extra step this time around is going to be our districts. So the districts are more fleshed out here. You still follow the same steps as in cities, but now they're getting more detailed. You have to think about things like the condition of each district. Where are the poor people going? Where are the wealthy people going? And stuff like that. And I really do like the layout of this entire book. I like that we get a column of rollables and then another column, and it's very separated. It's easy to read. It's not like just haphazard all over the place. They really did think about how to fit everything into a very easy to read table. Even if we get something like this, the location nobility, which has 2 columns, that's all you're pretty much getting if it fits. So like if we take a look here at the magic shop specialization, we get a rollable table here, or we get information here and a very small rollable table there. And I like that, of course, the tables are color coded, or at least the headers are red. So that makes it very easy to read, especially when you've been rolling or been staring at this book for quite a while. And then, of course, we get our sample settlements. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages worth of capitals. And of course, again, we're adding a lot more detail this time around. So, of course, we're going to need more paper. And I believe that the character sheets for the capitals was at 4 or 5 pages long. So you do have a lot of work cut out for you if you create your own capital. Lord, I really like that. But then again, if you use these sample settlements, you're going to have everything that you need here, from the districts to who's running it and everything such as that. Look at that floating. Really cool. All right. The last chapter for the settlements portion is about fortresses. This is the oddball of the entire book, in my opinion. So instead of having an actual capital or city or something like that, we're getting a defensible building, basically. Everything in this chapter is substantially different than the previous chapters, which I think is why they've included it as the last one, so to speak. You still get a lot of the same basic information: the age of the settlement, the condition that it's in, what environment it's in. But when we actually get to the construction of the fortress, that's when things start to really kind of change. So we get things like a keep. If you want to increase the size of your fortress, you're going to include a keep. And then you have to start thinking about like how big is the keep itself and how many rooms you can fit. So it's very mathematical. You're going to actually have to do some calculations. So especially if you want to actually make a map for your fortress. And so you can get different rooms for your keeps and stuff like that, which is really cool. I like that they're adding this level of detail. So if your player should actually go into a fortress, or if they should happen to, claim a fortress for themselves and do something like that, then you're going to have all of this information, and the players might even get some opt-in to how to build their fortress and stuff like that. And one of the things I really like about this, like in the castle section, if you actually include a castle as part of your fortress, you get a style. And I like that they actually include a picture of what the style represents. That really helps me into creating a world and seeing how things piece together. And if I was actually going to make a map, then I would have a starter for like what it would look like potentially. So you actually start thinking about things like the wall and how many towers your fortress has. There's some really cool options in here that can make your fortress stand out. Like when I did my video on fortresses, I made a floating fortress. And that is something that they actually have here that you can buy. So Stronghold is probably, I think, the last addition that you can add. And when I did my tutorial video, this is the one that kind of let me down the most, but it also makes sense. These are extra things, extra defenses that you're adding to your fortress. It's not really adding new stuff. It's just making what the stuff you already have better. And that kind of makes some sense. And then, of course, you get some information on mapping out your fortress, because the last page in the book is an actual grid map for your fortress. So we have a ton of different fortresses here in these sample settlements, and some of them are, of course, your generic fortresses, which is really cool, but then you get some that really stand out. Like, I really like Eureka. I don't know what it is about trees, but when you put stuff in trees, I don't know. That's really cool, and I really like it. There's a ton of different fortresses here, probably more so than any of the other chapters in terms of samples, and I guess people just really wanted to make fortresses for some odd reason, which is fine by me. I would have really liked to have seen like some of these fortresses though mapped out like on a grid, like they have recommended, but having these types of I just noticed there's a chocobo in this book. I just noticed that, they're just the same kind of, map style as the rest of the book, which kudos to them for keeping it stylistically similar, but Again, I would have really liked to have seen those actual fortresses on the grid. So the last chapter of the book is about interesting NPCs. So to me, this is the part of the book that really doesn't fit well with the rest, because you just get sample NPCs that you could flesh out your settlement with. It doesn't really give you any information on how to create interesting NPCs. It's just interesting NPCs that other people have created, and they're plugged in here. It's even got the game stats and all of that. I think they could have just done away with this chapter, in my opinion. But then again, it was probably an extra from Kickstarter, so they had to have included it there. And let's be honest, the backers probably created these NPCs. That would be my assumption. Don't quote me on that, because I don't really know. But I do like that even though this is included, they separate the NPCs by their job types. You have things like commoners and bartenders and stuff like that, mayors. So it is organized in a way, just like the rest of the book, which is really cool, and I really do applaud them for keeping this whole beast of a tome very organized. And then we get our appendices, so we get an explanation of what the locations are, in the non-commercial locations, things like that. We get our encounter tables, so your urban encounter table is here. You have your rumors table, and you have useful tables. So these are generic tables for when you just need more random stuff. And that it is what it is. It's just random stuff on random stuff. So let's say you need a tavern name. You roll a d20 for the first half, and then you roll a d20 for the second half. Or if you need a class for some reason, you just roll a d12 for that, and there it is. So these are just really random tables, and people like random tables, but it is what it is. Hooks and situation builders. Alternate magic shop rarity. And then, of course, we have the appendix. And then we have our actual character sheets for each of the settlements, which you can actually download on their actual website. And they're actually fillable, too. So I think this book is a great tool for worldsmiths. If you are fleshing out a world, or if you have time to go through building a town or a city or a capital, then this book is absolutely perfect. I think this book ultimately falls flat with unnecessary information. And it's you as a DM to actually determine how much detail is too much detail. So if you don't think that your players are going to actually go through a certain detail of your settlement, then I would advise you to skip that section. Then again, this book isn't meant just for role players. This book is also meant for people who are writing books and other things like that too. So it is very system agnostic in that sort of sense. To me, the concept of a village is too small for this scope of a book. The only way that I would think to ever roll a village is if your players are actually spending an extended amount of time in said village. Maybe that's the village they came from and that village serves as a hub. Then yeah, I would go ahead and flesh out that village using the materials in this book. But I think villages, that whole chapter could just be cut out in my opinion. For everything else, this book certainly excels. Although, again, it's up to you to determine how much detail is too much. Regardless, I would highly recommend Spectacular Settlements to just about anyone who has an interest in creating cities, towns, capitals, etc. for whatever game you are playing. Remember, this is system agnostic, so it doesn't have to be just for 5e. This could be Pathfinder or any other fantasy type game. I'm going to plug this in here. I would love to see something like this, but in a sci-fi setting. That would be pretty cool. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Feel free to leave a comment down below. Give this video a huge thumbs up to support this series, and subscribe if you want to see more. I will see you guys in the next video.